Hello and welcome to the Small Agency Talk Show. I am your host, Chip Griffin, the founder of Saga, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am very happy to have here two good friends, Marcel Petitpas and Patrick Rogan. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
It is great to have you here. We're going to run the quick bumper that will just get our energy pumping, and then we will go ahead and dive into today's topics. So, we just have to have that level of excitement there. And, of course, I've managed to put the audio on my iPad here that I use as a monitor to make sure the stream is going. So we'll kill that off because nobody needs to hear us on delay. But the wonders of live shows, right, guys?
I need one of those for my show, Chip. Hook me up.
I forget what service I used. It was pretty simple to build it, but it does help get your energy going so that you feel like you're ready to roar. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to roar. So Marcel, you are the founder of Parakeeto, the host of the Agency Profit podcast. Why don't you just share a little bit about yourself with the audience and also where they can find you?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, CEO of a company called Parakeeto, and we exist to help agencies, primarily smaller agencies, we're thinking 100 employees and less, be more profitable and get more insight into the numbers and questions in their business that they need to answer every day to make money and stay above water. So we have the Agency Profit podcast, which is a great place to learn about all the things that we're working on, the concepts that we're talking about, as well as our blog. And you can find me on LinkedIn or at parakeeto.com or marcelpetitpas.com if you want to reach out and chat about nerdy stuff like agency profitability.
And that's what we're going to talk about today, because profitability actually matters, right? The reason why we own small agencies or small businesses is, generally speaking, to make money. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we do, Patrick, our HR guru, you're back for, I can't even count the number of appearances you've had on my shows. It's certainly always appreciated because you have great insight on the talent side of the business. And after all, that's what we sell in agencies. We sell our time in one form or another. No matter how much we may try to get away from it, that's what it comes down to. So share a little bit more about yourself and where folks can find you.
I'm Ignition HR, based in Maryland, and I help organizations with their people challenges. Spend a lot of time in the talent space, a lot of time in the compliance space. So round it all together, it's a lot of fun, a lot of activity. And if you need me, reach me on the ignitionhr.com. I'm easy to find.
Fantastic. Well, all right. So we've got a couple of folks here with me today who are focused on time, talent, profitability, all those kinds of things, operations side. So I thought that's where we would start. But of course, if you're listening to us live and if you've got a question or you've got something that you want to discuss, feel free to share that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching on. We would love to incorporate your feedback and questions live. But if you want to be quiet and just listen, that's fine too, because we've got plenty to talk about. So I thought we would start on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I know it's something that I've talked with both of you about on previous shows, but bringing this collective brain trust together, I think, is particularly helpful. And that is the importance of time tracking and how you do time tracking effectively so that you both maximize your profits, but you're also dealing with all of the HR issues that come with it. And when we were talking about this by email in advance of the show, one of the things that you pointed out, Patrick, are that there are some risks that come associated with time tracking. So, Marcel and I, we'll always lean into we need it for optimal pricing and getting proposals right and making sure that we're generating profits. But we also have to keep in mind that you have to do it correctly. Otherwise, you may get yourself into trouble. So let's start with why it's important. And so for that, we'll go to Marcel, and then we'll turn to you, Patrick, to talk about some of the compliance issues that it brings up.
Great.
Sure. Yeah. So, starting out, generally myself and the HR person would typically be at odds on this issue, but I would not be surprised if Patrick and I were actually pretty aligned on how we think through time tracking and how it should be properly implemented in the agency. But my thought process
Patrick is a very approachable HR person, just so we're clear. Patrick is not the let's just focus on the paperwork. He's a human type HR person, which is what I love about him. So
excellent.
I had to get that in there.
I think that, that's an important thing to call out, right? Is when we think about what is the purpose of time tracking, and generally people don't like tracking time. I don't think I've ever met anyone who, when I ask them what their favorite part of their day is, they say, I just love opening up my timesheets and filling those in. That's the best part of my day. I mean, nobody likes doing it. However, there's a lot of things that we do that we don't enjoy because they benefit us and they're a good thing for our health and for our life. For example, going to the gym. I don't enjoy doing it, but I'm glad that I do every time that I do. And it gives me a lot of benefits that I'm able to carry through the rest of my day. That's how we should be thinking about time tracking. It's important because especially in the world that we live in today, which is not really a time and materials world anymore. Most people are billing flat prices. They're billing on value. We're not necessarily selling time as directly as we did in the old agency world. It becomes important because we need to be able to scope work accurately if we are to do two very important things. The first one is make sure that our team doesn't have to work overtime because we misscoped a project and the deadline is not elastic, which is often the case. That's the first and most important reason that I think time tracking is important. And the second is because if we can't scope projects, then we can't do an effective job of protecting our margins, which means we're more likely to have less cash in the business, have to lay people off when there's slow times or lapses in the sales pipeline and dips in utilization. And so that helps us protect against all of those things. And I think the mistake that a lot of folks make is they don't use time tracking data in that way. And they also don't involve the team in the application of time tracking data for improving scoping accuracy and then actually helping them see and realize the benefits that exercise can have on them. And that's, I think, where a lot of the issues around time tracking start to arise.
Yeah, and I think that's really key is to help the employees understand the value of time tracking to them, right? Because as you say, we all hate it. I mean, I started doing timesheets for the first time back 27 years ago now, and I hated it. It was torture. And I don't think that the agency I worked at then did a good job of explaining why it was useful to me as a junior account executive to be filling those things out. I just thought it was basically Big Brother keeping an eye on what I was doing. The reality is that time tracking, when done well, helps you, as you say, scope the project correctly, which means that you're not pulling those all-nighters to get things done because you couldn't estimate it correctly. But it also helps management figure out when it's time to bring in new resources, when you've assigned too much to one individual. And so I think if you sell it that way, I mean, that's important, right? I mean, Patrick, you want to make sure that the team actually understands the value of what they're doing and they don't see it as a Big Brother exercise.
I think that's key. And I think making sure, like no one, like you hit it on the head, Chip, no one likes tracking time, myself included. But I agree with Marcel too, in terms of, look, this is a business. And one of the dimensions where I get pulled in frequently is from managing talent perspective. How do I effectively manage and motivate my talent? So one of the questions I'll typically ask is, okay, so where are they spending their time right now? Well, they work on these clients. Okay, so how much time are they putting in on each client, and what kind of a return are you getting on that? Well, I don't know. We don't really track that. Ooh, okay. So from a talent management perspective, the first step you really need to know is who's doing what and how much time they're spent doing it. If you don't have a grasp of that, then you're missing a key component that you need to manage and motivate your talent. So that's one that really comes right off the top that I think is important that organizations understand and get their hands around it really quickly. I've got others too. I've got bad things they need to avoid. So we'll get to those in a little bit too.
We'll get to the bad, but first we want to make sure we're selling everybody on the benefits of it before we give them a little bit of a scare over, some of the issues that it can create. And so, Marcel, you obviously are working with folks to help them ingest all sorts of data to make sure that they're doing proposals and pricing correctly, right? I mean, that's the core functionality of the Parakeeto platform. And so, getting this right actually matters, which means you also need to encourage people to be honest in their reporting. And I think that's another challenge that I often see is that employees will shade their timesheets either to keep the bosses happy while they're also keeping the client happy, or to make themselves look busy, or whatever. And so honesty is important here too, right?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that behavior is the result of some antiquated metrics being carried forward into this new agency world, utilization being probably the biggest culprit. I don't believe that utilization is an effective metric to be exposing to your core delivery team. At the lowest level, maybe your project managers are paying attention to that number, but really utilization is the management team's metric. If your team's utilization is low, that's not their fault. They don't have enough work to do. That's your problem. That's your fault as the manager of the agency. So I think really being clear about like compliance and accuracy and completeness as the things that you're keeping your team accountable to on timesheets, and really encouraging to be as honest as possible in those timesheets is super important. And that comes from not policing people based on timesheets. It comes from not slapping them on the wrist when they go over budget on a project, and instead using that information to facilitate a conversation about why did these things happen? Is there something that we can learn from this? Can we do a better job of scoping this? Is there something in our process that we're overlooking, right? And getting them involved and getting value from that conversation, as opposed to saying, hey, Chip, you went way over budget on this project, I'm slapping you on the wrist. Or, hey, Pat, your utilization was low last week, I'm slapping you on the wrist. Because if you start to do that, then people are just going to put whatever they need to put in their timesheets to keep those conversations at bay. And then you end up with, basically a poison well, and that data source that you're relying on and building all of your operational systems on top of, right? I want to remind everyone of this, like your scopes of work, that is the foundation that all of your agency operations is built on. All your forecasting with people, all your forecasting with cash and profitability, all of that is based on those assumptions about what it takes to get work done. If you're poisoning that well, you're setting up all of those systems for failure. So it's really important to encourage those behaviors around timesheets of honesty and completedness, and really avoiding any desire to police people or discipline them based on their timesheets, so that they don't start to come up with these behaviors as a way to defend themselves.
Right. And utilization ratios are just, it's a nonsense metric that I hate seeing used. It's useful to track it, to be aware of it and understand why it is what it is, but it should never be used as an enforcement mechanism and say, okay, this individual needs to be 85% billable or whatever, because you need to understand, if they're not 85%, why aren't they? And honestly, most of the time it's because of management. Most of the time when someone doesn't hit a quote-unquote target utilization rate, it's because of management's assignments to them. They're having too many internal meetings. Yep. They're bringing them into new business things that aren't quote-unquote billable. There's a lot of things that go into that mix. So be aware of it, but don't manage to it. Don't try to get your employees to an arbitrary number. And by the way, that brings up my just huge beef with rules of thumb. I just chop those thumbs off. I don't want rules of thumb, because what's right for your agency is not necessarily right for the one next door. You need to figure out what works for your team and the way it's composed, particularly in these days where you've got all sorts of hybrid work structures and that kind of thing. Yeah. But you have raised honesty, as I have. Patrick, honesty is great, but that's where you can start talking about some of the scary things that come forward when you start talking about honest reporting, right?
You can, but let's stick with utilization as a key metric just for 1 second.
Sure.
So here's another problem that I see in agencies where utilization is stressed and sometimes tied to compensation. Bad. That's bad. Please don't do that, because what you're doing is you're creating a financial incentive for bad behavior, right? And just don't do that. Look at overall contribution to the organization. Look at innovative concepts and marketing campaigns that have come out. Look for a whole host of other things if you want to reward someone financially. But if you put a reward that's based on, a financial reward on utilization, my experience is you're going to get gaming of the system, you're going to get inaccurate data, you're going to get all these things that are going to not add any value. So that's one thing. Utilization struck a little bit of a nerve with me. I was like, oh, I've been there. Yeah. That's bad. Don't do that.
Right, and just arbitrary numbers for anything. I remember in that first job that I was talking about, we had a cap on the number of hours that we could spend each week on certain clients. Now, the problem was we had one client that was particularly difficult and demanding. And so those of us who were in junior positions were left with a horrible choice. We could either limit the number of hours that we were working for the client and have them yell at us, right, or we could report the numbers and have management yell at us. So we had to take our pick. And so what did we do? We fudged our numbers. We put things into, to overhead accounts or new business accounts or, places where we could bury our time so that we could still stick to the billable limit we had for the client without making them angry at us for not getting projects done on time. So anyway, So, all right. So, I would like you to get into the scary stuff, though.
All right, let's do it.
Because I don't want to get the scary stuff at the very end and then have everybody walk away from the show saying, oh, my God, timesheets are horrible, because they're not. But you do have to do them right, and you do have to be aware of the compliance issues that come up with it.
The timesheets, we all agree, are a great business tool, and there are a lot of advantages to the organizations if used appropriately. I think everyone agrees with that. One of the questions that I frequently ask quickly with organizations who don't do timesheets is, very quickly, I'll say, well, so if you're not tracking time, how do you know when someone's eligible for overtime? And then frequently the answer to that question is, well, everyone here is exempt. And then I go, really? There's this thing called the Fair Labor Standards Act, and they have really tight requirements on who's eligible to be paid overtime and who's eligible to be paid a salary. So maybe we should review that. Opens up a whole new can of worms. When you don't track time, then by default, you have to pay people salary. You have to have some mechanism to figure out how you're going to pay people. And without having those records on file, this is the bad news. You are at serious risk. Not only do you have to have the records, you got to maintain them for 3 years, and in some states longer. So yeah, just from a very small angle here, for your non-exempt employees, for the employees who are overtime eligible, you have to have good records for that. And if you're going to do that, why not do everybody? I mean, it's the same process, right? Whatever tool you're using or spreadsheet, just use it for everyone.
Right. And you've raised a good point here because, like so many regulatory and legal issues, small business owners of all kinds, but particularly small agency owners, they don't understand what all of the things that they need to comply with are. But in this particular case, I think there's this misconception amongst a lot of small agency owners that if they simply pay someone a salary and say that they're exempt, they're exempt. And
right.
They don't understand that's there's no get out of jail free card on this. You actually have to look at it in terms of, at least here in the United States, and I'm sure other countries have their own rule sets around this, but in the United States, the Fair Labor Standards Act and sometimes state law as well kicks in that will govern who you can actually throw the exempt tag on. And this is something that's been looked at by the federal government in recent years as far as making it much more difficult to exempt employees from overtime.
Yeah, and there are 3 categories. So there's professional, and executive, and administrative, and it's kind of complex figuring out like if someone fits in one of those categories or not. And then there are minimum salary amounts you're going to have to, if you pay less than $684 a week, so that's $35,000 and change a year, then you automatically don't qualify. Like if you're in violation right there. So yeah, it does get a little bit tricky, and bear in mind there are frequently state and local compliance things you need to be aware of as well. And don't forget the record keeping. You have to maintain at least 3 years for all of your hourly employees, just in case you get audited. Those are things just off the top of my head that I see frequently. And I've seen organizations with up to 100 employees, everybody on salary, and like it scares me. But we can quickly help get them on straight and narrow when we need to. So, but yeah, that's critical.
I have a bone to pick with this, Chip, if you don't mind, which is just like this is one of the things about this industry that both angers me tremendously, but also motivates me to do what I do, which is I think part of where this comes from is the agency industry is one of those industries that's for many, many years run this playbook that exploits employees a lot of the time. The management is not running the organization well, and the belief is everybody needs to work 60, 70 hours a week for this business to work. And the reality is that that's not how this business model works. You should be able to net very good profits, 25, 30% EBITDAs annually, with everyone working 40 hours a week with no exceptions and getting paid time off and having vacation and sick days and training days. Like when you model your business, if you protect your scopes of work properly, if you resource plan people properly, if you run the business well, that should not be a challenge. And unfortunately, so many agencies have run for so long, letting the employees subsidize the poor management of the business that they actually believe that that's necessary in order to be profitable. And it's simply not true.
Well, it's poor management, but it really, and that poor management leads to really the core problem, which is poor pricing, right? Which is why I love what you're doing, because it's so important to get your price correct. And a lot of agency owners are afraid to charge what it really costs to do something because they're afraid that the client's not going to be willing to pay it. But that just means that you're either doing it inefficiently and it's taking you far too long to do whatever work you're creating, or more likely you're not doing a good enough job of selling the client, the prospect, on the value of the work that you're doing. And if you get that right, you're absolutely right. There's no reason to force your employees to subsidize your bad pricing model. And many agencies do have that mindset that they just expect. I mean, most of the agencies that I've worked in over the years, they just expected you to work 60 hours a week. That was sort of, those were the table stakes, right? If you weren't willing to do that, then go look somewhere else. And that's just not a good way to run a business, because it means that you don't have a realistic understanding of the work that you're doing.
And there's something I want to touch on there, which is, and it's funny because these two concepts get conflated all the time. And many people look at them as being the same thing, but pricing and scoping are not the same thing. Those are two separate exercises that are often related to one another, but they are not the same thing. So scoping, the way I think about this is scoping is what it costs you to do work. Pricing is all about how much you get paid for that work. And maybe if you're in a time and materials world, those things are going to be very, very tightly coupled. But again, those are two separate exercises. One you're doing for yourself, for your business, for your operations, to create clarity for yourself. And the other you're doing simply to figure out how much money you can get out of the client for that amount of work. And you want to reconcile those things, of course, always, to make sure that the margin is there and that the project's a good fit and all of that stuff. But they are not the same thing, and they don't always have to happen in lockstep. And I think that's where a lot of people start to get tripped up, is when they're thinking about what price do we put in front of the client, they start gaming the numbers in their scoping document to get to that number. And it's like, who does that benefit? That benefits absolutely no one. If you're going to change the price, just change the price, but it doesn't change the reality of the scope of the work. So let those two things be independent.
Right. And that's one of those key areas where it's important to have your employees on board, because the corollary to scoping correctly is scope creep. Because even when you scope initially correctly, you may get into a place where the client asks for something and the team just says yes. And part of that is because managers, generally speaking, do a very poor job of actually explaining to the day-to-day workers on the account what the scope of the agreement actually is, right? There's this fear. I don't want to, they can't see the contract. They can't see, all the details. Well, they need those details, because if they're the ones figuring out whether to say yes or no on a day-to-day basis and they don't know is it in or out of scope, that's a problem. But timesheets also help you to surface those things, because if you see that somebody's working on something that's out of scope, that's a great tool for you to then have a conversation with the client and say, hey, we're doing this out of scope work. We need to, we either need to have an amendment or we need to change something or whatever. And so, Patrick, I think that's one of those key benefits that employees can see from, proper time tracking. But I'm curious what your experience is with transparency, and how do you convince managers to be more transparent with employees? Because I assume you would agree that in general they're not transparent enough.
They're not. They tend, there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors, and part of it is based on ignorance. And one of the things that I tend to stress when scoping is about as far as I go on the HR side. I don't get into pricing, but scoping I think is important, because if you have a similar job that you've done for another client and you have accurate records on who spent what amount of time to complete that job, then that scoping process is going to run a lot easier the next time around. What I frequently see is scoping is an exercise in guessing, because there's no real data to base it upon that's hard and fast. The other thing I notice is organizations that make the transition and do solid timekeeping, they are amazed when they learn who they thought their most profitable clients were. Frequently, the largest client, where all the resources go to, they might be losing money on, when they have the data. So Marcel, that's more your area than mine. I'm sure you see it. But all of a sudden, it's amazing how priorities change in organizations once they make the transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to hear what you've seen on this as you've been working with agencies, because I know that the agencies that I talk to, I will often go in and help them do a profit exercise on their largest clients, and they are often shocked to realize that, I've worked with some large agencies that are having six-figure projects that not only do they not make money on, they actually lose money out of pocket, not even counting in overhead expenses or anything like that. They're actually spending more to service the client. And they say, well, the client's happy though. Well, of course they are, because you're paying them to be a client. I'd be happy too if you would do work for me and you would pay me to do the work.
Yeah, it's just incredible how much revenue, just top line revenue, is still this number that it has so much focus on it in the agency space, when it is so far from anything that you can use to make decisions in your business, because it's so detached from the reality of, how much of that is actually yours and not passing through to another vendor, not production revenue. Like, what is your actual revenue number, your agency gross income, and then what is your margin on that? Yeah, like how much time do you have to spend to earn that revenue? And this is when I say this, like, I talk a lot about revenue earning efficiency, right? And what is your efficiency metric? Are you looking at gross margin? Are you looking at an average billable rate? But like, you have to have a number to measure how efficiently your process and your people are able to get things done that then earn you revenue, because most contracts in an agency are designed so that you get some amount of money up front, and then you get paid as you finish things, as you deliver things to the client that they paid for. And so it is in your best interest to be as efficient as possible in terms of how much time it takes you and everybody on the team to get those things done, so that you can then trigger the next payment or the next invoice that goes out to the client. But this gets overlooked so often. You're absolutely right. Most agencies, when you ask them who their most profitable client is, they just look at the highest revenue number and they say that one. And there's absolutely no thought of, well, what is it actually costing us to earn that revenue?
From a transparency perspective, I've seen where organizations that will take that data and actually feed it back to their employees so that they know the project that they worked on actually generated profit can be extremely motivating for the employees. Mm-hmm. Now, you have to be careful how much information you share, but it kind of changed the mindset. Is our goal simply to make our clients happy, and do we work as many hours as we can do to make that happen? Or is our goal to support this organization, this business, and deliver what the clients need in a profitable way? And are we willing to share some of that information with our employees? I've seen organizations do that very successfully, and that can be a nice motivator versus work more. Did you work 60 hours? I mean, oh, come on.
Right. I mean, so we've talked a bunch about the importance of time tracking for the purposes of pricing, scoping, and making sure that you're profitable with clients. But part of it is a management tool to try to figure out how your team is performing. But how do you do that, Patrick, in such a way that you're not using it as a club to beat your employee with, but instead trying to figure out, okay, I'm seeing from this timesheet it's taking you 5 hours to do something that really should only take about an hour. How do you balance that out and figure out how to help them become more efficient without them becoming afraid and then therefore being dishonest in their future time reporting?
Yeah, that's a key question, Chip. And I think the first step in answering that is to make sure you don't first communicate that to your employee at the year-end performance discussion. I think if it's part of a weekly conversation where you're talking about productivity and advancing in your career and making clients happy, I think that's the frame to make that conversation productive and helpful. And I'm not sure it even needs to be a part of the year-end discussion, because really that's not the reason why we're having this conversation. What we're talking about is motivating and engaging our staff and making sure we have a profitability on the work that we do for our clients. Because it could be, maybe the problem is if I'm the business owner, maybe the problem's me. Maybe I didn't scope this correctly and I need to do it differently in the future. And I'm learning that because I'm finding out there's stuff there that I didn't realize needed to be done. So I think that's key, to make it part of regular, weekly, bi-weekly conversation. It doesn't have to be real formal. It can be very conversational. It can be done over Zoom or a phone call, or it could be in person, whichever. I think that's the key. Make it a conversation. And now you've sold it, right? You've demonstrated to your employees why we're keeping time. Now they see it. And that, I think that adds value that way from a performance management perspective.
Yeah, and I think you've really zeroed in on an important part of this framework, which is use this information to ask questions. Don't jump to conclusions first. Use it to make inquiries, because it's possible that task that took 5 hours instead of 1, there may actually be a very good reason. It may not be that the employee is just a slow nitwit who doesn't follow direction well or whatever. It may be you didn't give good direction. Maybe they didn't have the right training. It may be that they were having problems with some other part of your agency or with the client in getting them the feedback they needed. There's so many things that can go into it, and it often helps you to uncover broader issues that you can address, and maybe doesn't just fix that 4-hour time discrepancy with that one employee, but maybe makes you a better agency overall because you've uncovered the core issue.
I'd love to double click on that for a moment, Chip, if I could.
Absolutely.
it's funny because, what we're all talking about here, and Pat and I, we haven't met before. He has basically no context on what we do, but everything you're saying, Pat, is so completely aligned to the frameworks and the methodologies that we've been using in our product, as well as in the consulting that we do. And, we talk about this. We may have talked about this on your podcast, Chip, our 4-step framework, the agency profitability flywheel, which has 2 feedback loops built into it. One is all about data. So it's estimates versus actuals and making sure that you have a connection between those 2 things so you can reference your estimates, see if they're accurate, and then use the data to make them more accurate over time. And then the second piece of that is all about the team, right? It's having regular cadences in which you sit down, you talk about what went as we expected, what didn't go as we expected, why did that happen, and engaging your team in surfacing process improvements, process maintenance that needs to be done in order to start closing those gaps and making things more consistent and more predictable. And I think the problem that a lot of people have, to your point, Chip, is they try to rely on the data alone to answer those questions. And what that ends up often happening is forcing them into a data schema that is unsustainable. It's not sustainable for the team to maintain, and it's not sustainable from a reporting perspective for them to actually get their answers. So they try to track time to the subtask on the sub-deliverable within the phase and the data schema just gets way too long. Whereas if okay, we're going to get directionally accurate insight from our data. Therefore, we can keep it simple and we can keep it at relatively high level. It's easy to maintain, it's clean, it's easy to report on. And then we'll get the rest of the context from talking to the team regularly. It doesn't put as much of a burden on your data to try and answer these questions, which it's not going to do an effective job of doing anyway. So really being clear about having both those feedback loops in place is important, because I think a lot of people get a little too excited about, well, if we tracked all of these different data points, then we can answer all these questions. And most of the time, the juice is just not worth the squeeze there. And you're better off keeping the time tracking data simple and then using that to inform really good conversation with the team.
Right. I think that's a great point, because I think all of us here on the show today love data and love looking at numbers and understanding what it can tell us. But at the same time, it's just one piece of the input and one piece of the decision matrix that you need to have. And it's one of the reasons why I don't particularly enjoy the phrase data driven, even though it rolls nicely off the tongue. It really should be data informed, because the data can't make the decision for you. You need to actually look at it in the context in which it comes. Patrick, any final words of wisdom that you can offer before we use the data point that we are slightly over 30 minutes, and I try to keep these live streams as close as possible to 30 minutes?
Yeah, just real quick, when the data piece, I'm a data junkie myself too, but when you think about it, data plus conversation equals understanding. Mm-hmm. And each component, I think, has an equal value. But you can't do just one or the other. You need to have all for an evidence-based conversation that can hopefully get something done. So yeah, that's my tidbit of wisdom.
Excellent. Well, I will make the data-informed decision that we are at 32 minutes, so we will wind this up. I didn't make a data-driven decision, which would have caused me to hit the end button at the 30-minute mark, and that would have been awkward, because that would have been in the middle of something that Marcel was saying, and then he would probably never agree to be a guest on this show again. But Marcel, Patrick, I really appreciate the fact that you came on. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. I know that it will provide lots of information for agency owners trying to think about time tracking and how it fits in to the strategic planning and pricing and all of that for their agency. So that will bring to an end today's episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. We'll be back here at 12 noon Eastern Time next Friday with a new panel and a new topic. And until then, have a great weekend and a great week next week.